The advertisement was simple. Brutally simple. Rancher seeks wife. Must be obedient. Must be quiet. Must not have opinions about how things are run. Good cook preferred. Reply to Box 14, Dust Creek, New Mexico Territory. 43 women read that advertisement in the spring of 1884. 42 of them set it down and walked away. One folded it carefully, tucked it into the breast pocket of her riding coat, and began making plans. Her name was Clara Voss. And she was not quiet. She was not particularly obedient. And she had more opinions about running a ranch than most men accumulated in a lifetime of trying and failing. She had watched her father's spread go bankrupt because the men he hired were proud and stupid. She had watched her brother ride it into the ground because he confused stubbornness with strength. She had spent 11 years learning every lesson that land had to teach: the water tables, the grazing rotations, the way cattle moved before a storm. The way a corrupt land agent smiled right before he lied to your face. She had also, somewhere in those 11 years, learned to shoot. Not the way women learn to shoot in dime novels, reluctantly, tearfully, with trembling hands and a moral crisis attached. Clara learned the way soldiers learned. Deliberately. Repeatedly. Until it was as natural as breathing. When she stepped onto the platform at Dust Creek Station, there was no wagon waiting. No rancher holding his hat in nervous hands. No welcoming party of any kind. Just dust. Heat. And a town that watched her the way a pack watches something it hasn't decided to attack yet. She stood there with one trunk, one rifle case, and a leather satchel that held 3 notebooks filled with agricultural calculations. She looked at the town. The town looked back. And somewhere out at the edge of Dust Creek, at a ranch called the Broken Spur, a ranch that was quietly, invisibly, catastrophically falling apart, a man named Harlan Cole sat at a kitchen table staring at the wall. Completely unaware that the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to him had just arrived on the noon train. She hadn't come to be his wife. She had come to save his ranch, and she already knew exactly how to do it. What she didn't know yet was that someone was trying to make sure that ranch burned to the ground before she got the chance. The town of Dust Creek had the particular quality of a place that had once hoped for something and then given up. You could see it in the buildings, storefronts that had been painted bright colors once, the red and yellow of ambition, faded now to something closer to resignation. You could see it in the faces of the men on the boardwalk, the way they leaned against posts with the posture of people who had stopped expecting the day to surprise them. Clara Voss noticed all of this in the time it took her to pick up her trunk and carry it toward the only hotel she could see. She noticed the sheriff's office with its door standing open in the heat. She noticed the saloon, the Copper Nail, doing business at 2 in the afternoon, which told her something about the town's relationship with hope. She noticed the land agent's office at the far end of the street, freshly painted, the only building on the block that looked new. That told her something too. Fresh paint in a dying town meant somebody was still making money. The question was always whose money they were making it with. She got a room at the hotel. The man behind the desk was somewhere between 50 and ancient, with eyes that had seen too much and decided to stop caring about most of it. He took her coin without comment. Then he looked at the rifle case. "Hunting trip?" he said. "Business," Clara said. He slid the key across the counter without another word. She spent an hour in her room going over her notebooks. She had never been to the Broken Spur. She had never met Harlan Cole. But she had done something that most people in her position would never have thought to do: she had researched him. She had spent 3 weeks before leaving St. Louis corresponding with anyone she could find who knew anything about the ranch and the territory around it. What she had learned was this: the Broken Spur was a 1,000-acre cattle operation that should have been prospering. The land was good. The water access was adequate. The herd numbers 2 years ago had been solid. But in the past 18 months, the ranch had lost cattle at a rate that defied ordinary explanation. Harlan Cole had dismissed 3 foremen. Two of his best hands had quit without giving reasons. He had missed 2 payments to the Territorial Bank, which was being administered locally by a man named Silas Pratt, whose freshly painted office Clara had noticed the moment she stepped off the train. Silas Pratt was the kind of name that appeared in her notebooks with a question mark beside it. A question mark that had, over 3 weeks of research, developed a very suspicious weight. She was still thinking about Silas Pratt when she heard the boots on the staircase. Heavy. Deliberate. The walk of a man not bothering to be quiet about it. The knock on her door was one hard knock. Not a polite knock. A statement. She crossed the room, and she did not open the door without first positioning herself to the side of it, a habit so deeply ingrained by now that she didn't even register doing it. She kept her hand near the pistol on her hip. The door swung open. The man in the hallway was large. Not tall, wide. Built like something that had been compressed rather than grown. He had a star on his vest that caught the light from the hallway window, and a face that communicated clearly that the star was not the thing he trusted most about himself. "Clara Voss?" he said. "That's right. Sheriff Aldous Crane." He did not offer his hand. "You're here about the coal place." "I'm here on personal business," Clara said. "You answered an advertisement," the sheriff said. "Coal's advertisement. For a wife." The way he said it contained something, not mockery exactly, but its first cousin. "I want to be straight with you, Miss Voss. The Broken Spur is not a good situation right now. Harlan Cole is not in a position to be taking on complications." Clara looked at him steadily. "Are you here on his behalf?" "I'm here on the town's behalf." "Then tell the town I'll be riding out tomorrow morning." She smiled, and it was not a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that closed a negotiation. "And Sheriff, I'd be curious to know who told you I was on that train." "Because I haven't spoken to a soul in this town except the hotel clerk." She watched the question land. She watched him decide not to answer it. She watched him leave. She closed the door and stood in the quiet room, listening to his boots retreat down the stairs. Then she opened her notebook and wrote one more name with a question mark beside it. Sheriff Aldous Crane. Then she sat down on the bed in the late afternoon heat and thought about what it meant that 2 people in this town already knew she was here and already wanted her gone, before she had even set foot on Harlan Cole's land. It meant she was already in the middle of something. Which meant, she thought with a calm that had taken years to develop, she had better understand it completely before anyone else realized she was looking. She ate supper alone in the hotel dining room. She watched the street through the window. At 7:15 in the evening, a rider left Silas Pratt's office at a pace that was more hurried than casual business warranted and headed north out of town, toward the open range. North was the direction of the Broken Spur. Clara set down her fork and watched the rider until the dust swallowed him. Someone was sending a message ahead of her. The question was what the message said. The Broken Spur announced itself the way troubled places often do, not with anything dramatic, but with a series of small wrongnesses that accumulated as Clara rode toward it in the early morning light. The fence line she crossed onto was mended in some places and neglected in others, the pattern of someone fighting a losing battle with too few hands and too little time. The grass along the creek bed was overgrazed in one section, completely untouched in another, which meant either the herd was being mismanaged or something was keeping cattle away from a portion of their own range. She noted both. She filed them away in the part of her mind that ran constantly, quietly, building a picture of what was actually happening on a piece of land versus what its owner believed was happening. She came over a low rise and saw the main house, and whatever she had been expecting, it wasn't this. It was a good house. Not grand. This was New Mexico territory, not Virginia, but solid and well considered. Built from adobe and timber with the kind of careful attention to shade and airflow that meant whoever had designed it understood the land they were building on. Someone with real thought behind them had built this house. The barn beyond it was equally well constructed. The corrals were sound. This was the architecture of a ranch that had been built by someone who intended it to last. What it hadn't been built by was someone who intended to fail. And yet, there were only 2 horses in the corral. Where there should have been 6 or 8 working animals, there were 2. The bunkhouse door was closed, and no smoke came from its chimney, which meant either no hands were in residence, or the ones who were had no reason to be up and moving at 7 in the morning. Neither option was good. Clara tied her horse at the post near the main house and stood in the yard for a moment. The sun was still low, the air still carrying the cool edge that the desert morning held before it surrendered to the heat. A rooster somewhere she couldn't see was working through his obligations. Wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek bank with a sound like paper. The door opened before she knocked. Harlan Cole was not what she had pictured. She had pictured, from the tone of that advertisement, obedient, quiet, no opinions, a man puffed up with his own authority. A man who had inherited something or stumbled into it, and needed the confirmation of control over something smaller to feel real. She had been prepared for arrogance. She had built her entire approach around it. Harlan Cole was not arrogant. He was exhausted. He was perhaps 40, but standing in his doorway he looked like a man who had been 40 for a very long time. He was tall and lean in the way that hard work made men lean, and his face had the particular quality of someone who had been handsome once and stopped noticing. His eyes were gray and direct, and when they found her they did something she hadn't anticipated. They showed, very briefly and very genuinely, relief. Then the relief disappeared behind something more cautious. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Cole." There was a pause in which they assessed each other with the frankness of 2 people who had no time for pretense. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. "No," Clara agreed. "I don't imagine I am." He stepped back from the door, and she walked into the house. It was clean, cleaner than she would have expected from a man living alone. The kitchen was organized with a precision that looked habitual rather than performed, and this told her something about Harlan Cole that his exhausted face hadn't. He was a man who maintained order in the spaces he could control because the spaces he couldn't control were threatening to overwhelm him. He poured coffee without asking if she wanted it. She sat down at the kitchen table without asking if she should. They settled into the same space with the ease of 2 practical people. "I got a letter," he said. "I sent one. You said you had experience with cattle operations." "I ran my father's ranch from the time I was 16 until the bank took it," Clara said. "Then I worked 3 years as an independent land assessor. I've looked at probably 40 operations across Kansas, Missouri, and New Mexico. I know what a healthy ranch looks like. I also know what a ranch looks like when it's being deliberately damaged." The coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "What did you say?" His voice had gone very quiet. "I said I know what deliberate damage looks like," Clara said. "And from what I could see writing in this morning, Mr. Cole, you have a problem that isn't weather or bad luck or poor management. Someone is working against you. Systematically. With patience." She set her own cup down. 2 horses in that corral. Overgrazed creek pasture on the east side, untouched rangeland on the north, which means your cattle are being pushed or panicked away from water on a rotation. Your fence damage isn't random. And someone left your operation at a gallop last night from the land agent's office in town. The silence in the kitchen was the loudest silence Clara had ever sat in. Harlan Cole set his coffee cup down very carefully, as if doing it wrong might cause something to shatter that he couldn't afford to replace. "How do you know about Pratt?" he said. "I watched him," Clara said. "And I'm good at watching." She folded her hands on the table. "Now, are you going to tell me I'm wrong about all of this? Or are you going to tell me how long it's been going on?" He was quiet for a long time. Outside the cottonwoods moved in the morning wind. A hawk called from somewhere high and invisible. 2 years, he said at last. "Just over 2 years." Clara opened her leather satchel and took out her notebooks. She set them on the table between them like she was laying down cards. "Then we have work to do," she said. What she didn't say, what she kept to herself in the private, calculating part of her mind, was that she had already worked out in broad terms what was being done, who was doing it, and what it would take to stop it. She had worked most of it out on the train from St. Louis. But there were pieces she was still missing. And until she had all the pieces, she wasn't going to tell Harlan Cole everything she knew. Not because she didn't trust him. Because she didn't yet know who else in his life he had already trusted, and what that trust had cost him. Clara spent the first week at the Broken Spur watching before she acted. This was not a natural state for a woman of her temperament. She was built for movement, for decision, for the satisfaction of problems solved, but she had learned through hard experience that the most dangerous moment in any complex situation was the one where you understood just enough to think you understood everything. She had been wrong that way once. She wasn't going to be wrong that way again. She walked the fence lines every morning before the heat became punishing. She mapped the grazing damage in her notebooks with the methodical precision of a survey. She talked to the two remaining ranch hands, a young man named Eli, 16 and trying to look like he wasn't frightened, and an older man named Tomas who had been with the Broken Spur for 7 years and had the face of someone carrying a weight he hadn't figured out how to set down. Tomas was the more interesting of the two, not because he told her things, but because of what he didn't tell her. There was a specific question she asked him on the second day, about a section of range in the northwest corner of the property that her mapping suggested should have been in heavy use but showed almost no sign of recent grazing, and the pause before he answered was 1 second too long. A single second. But Clara had spent years listening to pauses. "Cattle don't move up that way much," Tomas said. "Why not?" Another pause. "Hard terrain." She looked at the terrain in question. It was flat. "All right," she said, and she watched him relax, and she noted the relaxation, and she moved on. She rode that northwest section alone the following morning. It took her 40 minutes to find what she was looking for, and when she found it she sat her horse very still for a long time in the early heat, thinking through what it meant. There was a fence line cutting through what should have been open Broken Spur range, not on any map she'd seen, not in any of the boundary documentation she'd reviewed. It was new fence. Well-sunk posts, good wire, the kind of investment you made when you intended the fence to be permanent. On the far side of it, running healthy and fat on Broken Spur grass and water, were at least 80 head of cattle bearing a brand she didn't recognize. She sketched the brand carefully in her notebook. She measured the fence line as far as she could trace it. Then she rode back to the ranch house and sat in the kitchen thinking for a very long time before Harlan came in from the barn. "Did you know you have an interior fence on the northwest section?" she said. He stopped in the doorway. "That can't be right. I measured 200 yards of it this morning. That's my land?" His voice had gone flat. Not angry yet, stunned. "I know it is," Clara said. "Whose brand is this?" She turned her notebook toward him. He looked at the sketch and something moved through his face, complicated and dark. "Harlan. That's James Pratt's brand," he said quietly. Clara had been expecting Pratt. What she hadn't expected was the next word. "Silas's brother," Harlan said. "He runs stock down south, near the border. I've never done business with him. I've never had a reason to." He sat down heavily in the chair across from her. "James Pratt is building a fence on my land and running his cattle on my grass, while Silas Pratt calls your loans and bleeds your operation dry from the bank end," Clara said. "And when you default, which at the rate you're going, will happen within 3 payment cycles, the bank forecloses. The land goes to auction." She paused. "And who do you imagine buys it?" The silence in the room had weight. It pressed against the walls. "They're taking the whole thing," Harlan said. It came out not as an accusation but as a man discovering that a floor he'd been standing on wasn't floor at all. "They've been planning this for 2 years. Longer, I'd guess," Clara said. "The fence posts are weathered. That wire has been up for at least a year." She closed her notebook. "The foreman you dismissed, what were the reasons?" he told her. Quietly, with the voice of a man reviewing his own mistakes. "The first foreman had quit, citing family reasons. The second had been caught altering cattle tallies, which Harlan had taken as theft. The foreman had been run off without anyone investigating further. The third had lasted only 2 months before leaving without explanation." Clara let him talk. She asked careful questions. And by the time the afternoon heat was at its worst, she had a picture that was nearly complete. Nearly. There was still the question of the sheriff. Of exactly how deeply Aldous Crane was embedded in this arrangement. Because the sheriff's visit to her hotel room on the day she arrived had not been coincidence, and it had not been innocent concern for a lone woman in a rough town. It had been a warning. And warnings came from people who had things to protect. "Tell me about Sheriff Crane," she said. Harlan's expression shifted. "Aldous is—" He stopped. Reconsidered. Started again. "He's been sheriff here for 6 years. He's not a bad man." "That's not what I asked?" Harlan looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to recognize, a kind of reluctant respect for the way she cut straight to the bone of things. "Aldous owes Silas Pratt money. A private debt. Gambling." He paused. "I've known about it for a year. I didn't think it was relevant." Clara said nothing. She looked at the wall. In her mind she was running through a sequence of events, what needed to happen, in what order, and what the risks were at each step. It was the same process she had used on her father's land and later on the property she'd assessed, and she was good at it, and she knew she was good at it. And she also knew that being good at something did not make you immune to the things that could go wrong. What could go wrong here was considerable. The Pratt brothers had time, money, legal infrastructure, and a sheriff in their debt. What Clara had was a rancher who was exhausted, a 16-year-old boy, a man named Tomas who was hiding something, and 3 notebooks. And a rifle. She stood up. "I need to go to town," she said. "I need to see the Territorial Land Registry. That's Pratt's office." "I know," Clara said. Harlan stood up too. "I'm coming with you." "No," she said. "You're staying here." He started to object, and she cut him off, not unkindly but absolutely. "If we walk into that office together, he knows we know. I need him to think I'm a woman handling paperwork. Something dull and domestic." She picked up her rifle case. "Trust me." He looked at her for a long moment with those gray, exhausted eyes. Then he said, "You're going in there armed." "I go everywhere armed," Clara said simply. "But I don't plan to need it today." What she did not say, because she didn't know yet, was whether the man she most needed to worry about on that trip to town was Silas Pratt or the one who had watched her leave the ranch, the one she'd caught, from the corner of her eye, slipping away from the barn while she and Harlan were talking. Tomas, who should have been mending fence on the south section, who had instead been standing within earshot of everything they had just said. The land agent's office smelled like paper and ambition and the particular kind of confidence that came from holding other people's futures in a filing cabinet. Silas Pratt was smaller than she'd expected from a man capable of this kind of scheme. Small men were sometimes the most dangerous. They planned more and gambled less, which made them harder to outmaneuver. He was perhaps 45, with the smooth-kept look of someone who understood that appearance was its own form of argument. He wore a good suit in the New Mexico heat and seemed not to sweat in it, which Clara found faintly unsettling. He looked up when she came in, and his expression went through 3 distinct phases in the span of a second: recognition, calculation, performance, before landing on something warm and professional that covered all 3 completely. "Miss Voss," he said. I'd heard you arrived. Good news, Travels? Clara said pleasantly. She sat down across from him without being invited. I'm here about some paperwork. Prenuptial matters, really. I want to be clear on the property holdings before I formalize anything with Mr. Cole. She smiled with just the right degree of feminine practicality. A woman has to protect herself, doesn't she? Pratt leaned back in his chair and gave her a smile that matched hers in warmth and exceeded it in insincerity. Very sensible, he said. I admire a woman who understands financial matters. I do try, Clara said. She asked him questions. Careful, specific, deliberately naive-sounding questions about the Broken Spurs loan structure, its payment history, the precise legal mechanism by which the bank would proceed in case of default. She watched him answer them. She watched what he chose to tell her, and what he chose to leave out, and the gaps were as informative as the words. But the real reason she was in this office was not the conversation. It was the filing cabinet behind his left shoulder. She had created a reason to move twice during the conversation, once to retrieve her notebook from her satchel, once to pour herself water from the pitcher on the side table, which she had deliberately chosen a seat that required passing close to. Both times she was reading labels. Both times she was memorizing what she saw. The section she needed was marked simply, Territorial Boundary Disputes, Active. It was a thick file. The thickness was interesting on its own. She spent 35 minutes in that office, and when she left she had confirmed 3 things. First, Pratt had filed an adverse possession claim on the northwest section of Harlan's property 14 months ago. Adverse possession required continuous open use of land for a specific period, in the New Mexico Territory, 7 years. Which meant Pratt had either been running cattle on that land for 7 years under everyone's radar, or he had fabricated records suggesting he had. Given the age of the fence posts Clara had inspected, fabrication seemed more likely. Second, the filing had been witnessed and notarized by Sheriff Aldous Crane, which answered the question of how deeply Crane was involved. Third, and most important, the adverse possession claim was still pending approval from the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe. It had not yet been granted, which meant there was still time. Not much time. Pratt had a follow-up appointment with a Territorial Commissioner scheduled for 11 days from now. But time. 11 days to build a case substantial enough to stop a claim that had 14 months of legal infrastructure behind it, backed by a local official and a bank. Clara rode back to the Broken Spur in the mid-afternoon heat with dust rising around her horse's hooves and her mind running through calculations with the clean, efficient intensity of machinery designed for exactly this purpose. She was so deep in thought that she almost missed the rider trailing her. Almost. She caught the movement at the edge of her vision, a horse keeping pace at distance, staying just at the border of the low scrub where the desert thickened. The rider was good. Staying parallel rather than following directly, using the terrain. That level of discipline meant this wasn't casual curiosity. This was someone who had been told to watch her. She made a decision quickly, the way she made all decisions, not impulsively, but with the compressed speed of someone who had already thought through most of the relevant variables. She turned her horse and rode directly toward the rider. She heard the scramble of hooves as he tried to pull back. She pushed her horse into a gallop, cutting an angle that would close the distance before he could reach proper cover. And in the minute that followed there was nothing in the world but speed and dust, and the sound of the land under hooves. She came around the back side of a dry creek bank and pulled up 20 yards from a horse standing with heaving sides, and its rider standing on the ground, hands raised. Because Clara's rifle was already out and pointing. She looked at him for a long moment. It wasn't Tomas. It was the young hand. Eli. 16 years old, his face gone pale under the sun damage, his hat knocked sideways. Looking like a boy who had just discovered that the thing he'd been told to do had consequences he hadn't considered. "Who sent you?" Clara said. Her voice was level. "Ma'am, my Eli. She kept the rifle steady, not pointing at him, past him. Enough to make the message clear without being a threat to a frightened child. "Who sent you to watch me?" His jaw worked. He was weighing something, loyalty against fear, and fear was winning, which was appropriate because fear was the smarter choice here. "Tomas said, Mr. Pratt wanted to know what you did in town," he said. Tomas said it would be fine. That it was just watching. Clara lowered the rifle and rested it across her saddle. "Tomas works for Pratt," she said quietly. Not a question. "I didn't know," Eli said, and from the look of him she believed it. "I swear, Miss Voss, I didn't know I thought he just knew Mr. Pratt from town." Clara sat for a moment in the flat, hard afternoon light, looking at the boy. He was 16 and scared, and he'd been used by people who were better at using people than he was at recognizing it. She had been 16 once. She had been surrounded by people better at things than she was. She understood the position. "Go back to the ranch," she said. "Don't tell Tomas you spoke to me." "Can you do that?" He nodded, fast and grateful. "And Eli?" He stopped. "You're going to have to decide, before this is over, whose side you're actually on." She turned her horse back toward the broken spur. "Make a good choice." She rode the rest of the way home carrying a new, colder understanding of how isolated Harlan Cole actually was. His hands couldn't be trusted. His sheriff was corrupted. His bank was weaponized against him. He had her. That was it. That was the whole of his reliable alliance. She unsaddled her horse in the barn, working through the motions with practiced efficiency, and she thought about 11 days, and what she could build in 11 days. And how much she was willing to risk to build it. She had not come to Dust Creek to risk anything. She had come because a problem had presented itself that she believed she could solve. But problems, she had found, had a way of becoming personal when you lived inside them long enough. Was that a weakness? She wondered. Or was it simply the price of giving a damn? She didn't have an answer. She went inside and started writing a letter to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, a letter that would need to be on the morning stage. And that needed to say exactly the right things in exactly the right order, and that represented, if she was being honest with herself, a gamble that could go very wrong. She sealed it. She thought about Tomas in the bunkhouse, and what Pratt now knew about her afternoon, and what he would do with that knowledge. Then she heard Harlan's boots on the porch, and the door opened, and he said, "Tomas is gone." She looked up from the desk. "He saddled up an hour ago and rode out," Harlan said. "Left his wages on his bunk." Clara looked at the sealed letter in her hand. "How long until Pratt does something aggressive?" she said. Not asking Harlan, asking the room. Asking the problem itself. "I don't know," Harlan said. "I do," she said. "Tonight." She was right. They came at 2 in the morning, when the desert dark was at its deepest, and the only sound should have been wind and the distant complaint of coyotes. Clara was not asleep. She had not expected to sleep. She was in the chair by the front window of the ranch house with her rifle across her knees and her second pistol on the table beside her coffee cup. And she was watching the darkness the way she'd learned to watch it, not by staring at it but by letting it exist in the soft part of her vision, waiting for the thing that moved within it. She counted 4 of them. Possibly 5, there was a shape near the far corral that she couldn't resolve into certainty. They came in from the northwest, which meant they knew the property and had planned their approach, which meant this was not improvised. Pratt had received Tomas's report, assessed the situation, and made a decision. Move now, before whatever she was doing could develop into something he couldn't control. She was at the bedroom door before the first one reached the barn. "Harlan," she said. No urgency in her voice. Urgency made people loud and loud made people slow. Just a word, flat and clear, like a key in a lock. He was up in seconds. She heard the distinctive sound of a man reaching for a weapon in the dark and making contact with it. 4, she said. Maybe 5. They're going for the barn first. She was already moving back to the window. Eli's in the bunkhouse. He'll hear them. He'll also be scared, Clara said. Can he handle scared? A pause. I don't know. Then we don't rely on him. She watched the shape near the barn resolve into a man with something in his hands, not a gun. Something larger. A lantern, she realized with a clarity that felt like cold water. They weren't here to kill anyone. They were here to burn. Burning was smarter than shooting. Burning was an accident. Burning left no bullets to find, no clear evidence of intent. Burning let Pratt express sympathy while his brother's cattle grazed on the ashes. She was out the back door before the first flicker of light appeared near the barn wall. The desert behind the ranch house was dark and familiar to her now after a week of moving through it. She crossed it fast, wide arcing to come at the barn from the south, away from the cluster of men. The night air was cold, the desert's particular cruelty, to be merciless with heat in the day and cold at night, as if the land itself couldn't commit to a relationship. She heard voices. Low, brief, professional. These were not panicked men. They were workers. Someone was paying them well enough that they treated arson like a job. She reached the barn's south wall and pressed herself against it, and in the darkness she controlled her breathing and she listened, and in 30 seconds she had what she needed. There were 4 men. Definitely 4, and they were positioned at the east door, the north corner, and the corral fence. 3 positions, which meant they were more worried about the cattle getting out than about anyone coming at them from behind. That was a mistake. She moved around the corner and put her rifle to her shoulder and fired twice into the air above the head of the man at the north corner and said, in a voice that came from a part of her chest she rarely used, "Next 2 don't go up." The silence that followed was exquisite. Then from the other side of the barn she heard Harlan's voice, steady and measured, telling the men at the east door the same thing with fewer words. And then, she had not expected this but she felt something that might have been gratitude. She heard the bunkhouse door and Eli's voice, shaky but present, from the direction of the corral. 3 voices. 3 angles. Against 4 men who had arrived expecting one sleeping rancher and a woman who didn't know what she was doing. The fire hadn't caught yet. There was a lantern on the ground near the east door. It had been placed but not broken, not thrown. She could see its glow from where she stood, steady and waiting. "Step back from the lantern," she said. "Step back from all of it, and stand where I can see you." One of them ran. She let him run. A running man was a man making a choice that would come back to find him, but that wasn't tonight's problem. The other 3 stood. In the lantern light she could see their faces now, and none of them were faces she recognized. Hired hands from somewhere else, brought in so there was distance between Pratt and the act. Harlan came around the corner with his pistol drawn and the flat look of a man who had been hit too many times and had finally placed his feet. "Anyone want to tell me who hired them?" Clara said. Silence from the 3 men. "That's fine," she said. "Silence has its own uses." She looked at Harlan. "Tie them. We'll take them to town at first light." He looked at her. "Crane won't do anything with them." "I know," Clara said. "We're not taking them to Crane." She picked up the untouched lantern from the ground and looked at its flame for a moment. "I made some contacts at the Territorial Land Office when I was assessing properties 2 years ago. I sent a letter to Santa Fe this evening on matters considerably more serious than 3 men with a lantern." She looked at the 3 men steadily. "By the time we ride into Dust Creek tomorrow, I expect there may be a federal presence that Mr. Crane will find very difficult to navigate around." This was, she acknowledged privately, optimistic. She had no certainty about the timing. The letter had gone on the evening stage, but Santa Fe was a day's ride and bureaucracies moved at their own pace, and she could not guarantee any of this. But the 3 men in front of her didn't know that. And she had learned, from 11 years of fighting for things against people with more resources than she had. That certainty was a currency you could sometimes borrow against when you didn't actually have it. Harlan bound the men. Eli, still shaking, but present, watched the horses. Clara stood in the barn doorway and watched the remaining darkness of the night over the desert and thought about tomorrow, and whether the letter would matter. And what Pratt would do when he heard that his 3 men hadn't come back. She thought about Tomas, riding somewhere in that same dark desert with Pratt's money in his pocket and information that was now, she calculated, approximately 6 hours old. She thought about the 11 days that were now 10. "Are you all right?" Harlan said. He had come to stand beside her. She considered the question honestly. "Ask me tomorrow," she said. He stood beside her in the dark without talking, which was, she thought, exactly the right thing to do. They stood like that until the eastern sky began to change color, and the cold retreated by degrees. And the desert came back into itself with the particular quiet authority of something that had always been there, and would always be there. Indifferent to all of them, and their small terrible urgencies. Then Clara said, "Get the horses ready." And she went inside to put on her riding coat, and load her spare ammunition, and prepare for the things she had been building towards since she had stepped off a train in a dying town with a rifle case and 3 notebooks. She was going to walk into the center of this. And she was going to do it before Pratt had time to build another defense. They rode into Dust Creek at 8 in the morning with 3 bound men trailing behind them on a lead rope, and the town looked at them the way towns look at things they hadn't planned for. Clara had planned for the town. She had sent a second letter the previous evening, not to Santa Fe, but to the territorial newspaper in Albuquerque. To a reporter named Samuel Hart, who had written about land fraud in the region 2 years prior, and whose instinct for the right story she had trusted enough to make contact with in her first week of research. The letter had told him where to be and when. She didn't know if he'd make it. She thought he might. He was standing outside the hotel when they rode in, and the notebook in his hand told her everything she needed. Silas Pratt's office was still closed at that hour. The sheriff's office was not. Aldous Crane appeared in his doorway as they dismounted, and his face went through a complicated evolution when he saw the 3 bound men, and then Clara's expression, and then, she thought, possibly the reporter. "What's this?" Crane said. "These men attempted to burn the Broken Spurs barn last night," Clara said. She spoke at a volume the street could hear. She did this deliberately. An audience was a form of accountability. They were hired for the purpose. "I have a witness to their arrival." She gestured to Eli, who had ridden with them and was managing to look older than 16 through sheer effort of will. "And I have physical evidence of their intent in the form of an unbroken lantern they abandoned when confronted." She looked at Crane steadily. "I'm bringing them to you as the local authority, Sheriff. I expect you to hold them for the federal deputy marshal who I have reason to believe is en route from Santa Fe." This was still optimism. But it was optimism that now had a reporter writing it down, and that changed its character completely. Crane's eyes moved to the reporter. Then back to Clara. Then to the 3 men. The calculation on his face was visible. It was the calculation of a man whose debts had just shifted in weight, who was trying to determine which direction the ground was tilting. "Bring them in," he said at last. It wasn't courage. It was arithmetic. But she'd take it. She had asked Harlan to stay outside. She wanted to handle the next part alone, and after 10 days of watching her work, he had learned to trust that when she said she needed space, the space was load-bearing. She crossed the street to Pratt's office and knocked, and when the door opened and Pratt stood there in his good suit with his composed face, she said, "May I come in? There are some things I need to tell you." He let her in. He was too controlled not to. Control meant not showing fear, and showing fear meant not letting her see that he already knew this morning had gone wrong. She sat across from him for the last time, and she laid it out. Not with anger. She had found that anger gave the other person something to push against, and she didn't want to give Pratt anything. She laid it out with the flat, dispassionate clarity of a land assessment. The fence. The cattle. The adverse possession claim. The notarized document with Crane's signature. The three men now sitting in the sheriff's office. The letter to Santa Fe. The reporter outside. Pratt listened. His face remained composed throughout. She had to admire it, in the detached way she could admire technical skill in an opponent. When she finished, he said, "That's a serious set of allegations." "Yes," she said. "You'd need substantial documentation." "I have it," she said. "The fence coordinates. The brand registration for James Pratt's cattle. The filing dates on the adverse possession claim. The timeline of loan pressure against Mr. Cole's operation." She opened the last of her notebooks. It was the most complete, 3 weeks of research and 10 days of observation compressed into 60 pages of handwriting. "I am also prepared to testify, as a credentialed land assessor with a documented record in this territory, that the adverse possession claim you filed is fraudulent. The land use hasn't been 7 years. It's been 14 months at most. The documentation you submitted to the Territorial Land Office is falsified. For the first time, something moved under Pratt's composed surface. You can't prove that," he said. "The reporter outside will help me try," Clara said simply. The silence held for a long moment. Outside she could hear the street sounds of a town going about its morning, the creak of wagon wheels, the voices of women at the dry goods store. A horse's complaint from the direction of the livery. The ordinary persistent noise of people living their lives inside the structures that men like Pratt built around them. "What do you want?" Pratt said at last. And under the composure she heard it, the sound of a man who had just recalculated the cost of continuing. "The fence comes down," Clara said. "The cattle move off Broken Spur land within the week. The adverse possession claim is withdrawn. The loan terms on the Broken Spur are renegotiated at the correct rate that Mr. Cole's operation warranted before you began manipulating his cattle numbers, and I have those numbers, because I've spent 10 days reconstructing them." She closed the notebook. "And you stay away from Harlan Cole's land for the remainder of your tenure in Dust Creek?" Pratt looked at her. "And if I don't? Then I testify," she said. "And the reporter publishes. And the federal marshal, whenever he arrives, has an extremely complete record to work from." She stood up. "You've been doing this carefully, Mr. Pratt." Slowly and patiently. "I respect the patience, actually. But you assumed Mr. Cole was isolated. He isn't anymore." She walked to the door and then stopped, because there was one more thing. She turned back. "Tomas Reyes," she said. "The hand who was feeding you information. He has a sister in Albuquerque with 3 children and no husband." She had learned this the same way she'd learned everything, by asking the right questions of the right people. "Whatever he owed you, consider it settled. Leave him alone." She didn't wait for an answer. She walked out into the Dust Creek morning, into the heat and the dust and the ordinary sounds of the street. And she stood on the boardwalk for a moment feeling something she couldn't quite name, not triumph exactly, because she'd learned that real victories were quieter than triumph sounded. Something more like the satisfaction of a calculation that had come out correctly. Of a thing that had been wrong, made less wrong. Harlan was waiting by the horses. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and there was between them the particular quality of 2 people who had been through something real together, and were standing on the other side of it. "Well," he said. "He'll take the deal," she said. "He doesn't have a choice that doesn't cost him more." Harlan was quiet for a moment. He turned his hat in his hands, the way, she had learned, he processed things he didn't have words for yet. "You came here," he said, "because of an advertisement I wrote. For a quiet wife." He looked at the hat. "I don't know what I was thinking. I was." He stopped. Started again. "The ranch was going under and I thought if I had someone steady beside me I could. I don't know what I thought." You were trying to solve a problem, Clara said. You solved it wrong, but the instinct wasn't terrible. He looked up at her. There was something in his face now that hadn't been there the morning she rode in, or rather, something that had been buried under 2 years of exhaustion was working its way back toward the surface. Something that looked, cautiously and unevenly, like the beginning of whatever came after. The advertisement said obedient, he said. I know, Clara said. I found that moderately hilarious. He laughed. It was brief and rough, like something that hadn't been used in a while, but it was real. What happens now? He said. For you. And here was the thing Clara had not planned for. She had planned everything else, the research, the strategy, the confrontation, the leverage. She had not planned for the question of what came next for her, because when she had boarded the train in St. Louis she had framed this as a problem to solve and had not thought very carefully about what a person did once the problem was solved. She looked at the Dust Creek Street. She looked at the desert beyond it, brown and vast and ancient, and completely indifferent to human plans. She thought about the fence that needed to come down. About the overgrazing on the creek pasture that would take 2 seasons of managed rotation to correct. About the herd numbers that would need to be rebuilt strategically, the water access patterns that could be improved with one well placed in the right location. The accounts that would need months of careful reconstruction. About the fact that Eli was 16 and could be taught. About the fact that Harlan Cole had built a good house with careful attention to shade and airflow, and had been losing it one piece at a time to men who were patient and willing to steal. She thought about her 3 notebooks, and all the space that was still blank. I suppose, Clara said slowly, that depends on whether the position is still available. Harlan Cole looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes that had stopped looking exhausted. Which position? He said. Because I think we've established the original one was incorrectly described. Significantly, Clara agreed. I'd want to renegotiate the terms. I'd insist on it. The heat was already building. The dust was already moving in the light desert wind. Somewhere behind them, in the sheriff's office, 3 hired men were trying to decide whether their employer was worth protecting. In an office across the street, Silas Pratt was making calculations that had stopped adding up. And in the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, a letter was working its way through the machinery of official attention, slowly, the way bureaucracies always moved, but moving. The federal deputy marshal arrived 4 days later. It was not the dramatic arrival that stories sometimes promise. No thunder, no crowd, no speech. Just a tired man on a tired horse who read Clara's documentation for 6 hours straight, and then went to see the sheriff and then went to see Pratt. And the conversations that followed were long and quiet and resulted in outcomes that took months to fully materialize. The adverse possession claim was voided. The fence came down. James Pratt moved his cattle south within the week. Silas Pratt resigned his position at the bank by the end of the month, though the more serious legal questions followed him longer and further than Dust Creek. Aldous Crane kept his badge. This was the decision that troubled Clara most, the one that sat in her mind at odd moments, that woke her in the early mornings when the desert was still cold and quiet. He had been complicit in something that had nearly destroyed a man's life and livelihood. He had used the authority of his office to enable it. And he kept his badge. She had pushed for something more. The federal deputy had cited insufficient direct evidence and the needs of a town that already had too little law. Was that justice? She thought about it often. She didn't resolve it. She suspected she wouldn't. Tomas Reyes was not charged with anything and was not found. Clara hoped, in the way she hoped for practical rather than sentimental reasons, that he had made it to Albuquerque. That the sister with 3 children had taken him in. That proximity to people who needed him would make him do better. She didn't know. She would likely never know. Eli stayed on at the Broken Spur. He turned out to have an instinct for cattle that Clara found genuinely impressive, The kind of instinct you couldn't teach, only recognize and cultivate. By the end of the first summer, he was managing the grazing rotation with a competence that made her think of the notebooks she'd kept at 16. And she felt something for him that was not quite maternal but was adjacent to it, the particular care of someone who recognizes a version of themselves in a young person and wants them to find an easier path to the same place. The broken spur recovered. Not quickly, ranches didn't recover quickly, and Clara hadn't promised quick. She had promised correct, and correct took 2 years of patient, unglamorous work. The cattle numbers came back. The credit was restructured. The northwest pasture that had been stolen back to nothing became, after a season of careful management, some of the best grazing on the property. She kept her notebooks. They grew into a 4th volume, then a 5th. They contained everything about that land, its water table and its grazing patterns and its particular seasonal rhythms, and she kept them not because she intended to leave but because she had always believed that knowledge written down was knowledge that survived you. She had come to Dust Creek for a rancher who wanted an obedient wife. What she had found was a ranch that needed someone who understood it completely, and a man who had the wisdom, once his exhaustion permitted it, to be grateful for the difference. The advertisement, Harlan once told her in the second winter, when the desert cold pressed against the windows of the house that someone had built with real attention to shade and airflow, had been the stupidest thing he'd ever done. Not quite, Clara said, looking up from her notebook. The stupidest thing you did was not ask the right questions before you started losing cattle. Fair, he said. But the advertisement had consequences you didn't plan for. Yes, he said. He was looking at her in the way that had developed gradually, without announcement. Over 2 years of working beside each other and building something, the look of a man who had been losing and had found, in the least expected form, something that made him want to win. Good ones. Clara looked back at her notebook. The 5th volume. Half full. Still a lot of work to do, she said. Yes, he said. And outside the desert night was absolute and cold and ancient and vast, and the cattle were quiet in the pasture, and the fence lines held where they were supposed to hold. And the land was exactly what land always is, indifferent to everything, and patient, and waiting for the people on it to figure out how to deserve it. She hadn't come to be saved. She hadn't come to save anyone. She had come because a problem existed, and she was the person most capable of solving it. Whether that made her remarkable or simply practical is a question the desert doesn't answer. It just holds everything that happens on it, and keeps going.